Howdy. So this is something that I wanted to talk about, I think first, before we start anything, just because basically I think it's a game of, I don't know, kind of like strategy and pre-planning and decision making before anything else. And knowing what you want your army to do before you start the game, I think is really, really important. So I feel like constructing your list is the kind of obvious place to start. And one of the things that I want to talk about before anything else is list archetypes, because basically this is what informs you what kind of list do I want to make before you even make it. So there's a bunch of different list archetypes. I think everybody kind of has their own little definitions, and like metas end up forming their own kind of opinions and stuff. But I think that you can kind of roughly break it down into a few distinct categories. Um, some of them have I guess like some of them are really similar and there's a ton of overlap, and honestly I think that categorizing them and putting them into little boxes is a little bit of a fruitless effort, because at the end of the day it doesn't really matter as long as you know how to play it and what you're doing with it and kind of how to identify your win conditions and stuff. So I think that when I'm categorizing these, it's more to give you a rough idea of what different armies can do, so much as to exactly be like, this is the ultimate example of like a board control army. So another thing to bear in mind is that your list archetype, you might have like a kind of defined style that you want to play, but if you're playing against certain other armies, then you maybe just need to change it up. They can force you kind of off of what's comfortable. So something to bear in mind for sure. Okay, so to start with, this is what I would call, I mean, this is the current like kind of boogeyman faction in the meta, right? But this is what I would call a board control army, a very aggressive board control army, where basically you're looking to take the entire table from your opponent and kill them. This is probably a better example, I think, of an aggressive board control army than the one that's just Hex Wraiths, because Hex Wraiths don't quite have the damage output that a list like this has, with the double blobs of Blade Geists and so on. This army is actually like, they're going to take the table off of you, and if you try and contest them, their plan is to kill you, as opposed to something like, say, old 3rd edition Soulblight, where they will take the table off of you with 200 zombies, but they're not really going to kill you quickly at all. And it's more of like a kind of, they're looking to deny space and battle tactics and so on. This one, it's going to try and kill you. And that's kind of what I mean when I say that there's lots of different little micro definitions and overlap and so on and so forth. Generally, I think that an army like this is, if it gets given first, it can often sit back and be like, okay, you walk forward, because if you, like I say, if you try and contest me for the middle, I'm going to kill all of your stuff. And if the army, kind of has the turn control, oftentimes it will let you go first because it wants you to come into its threat range, so it gets to attack you and really kind of utilize the control that they have. I think that, if you're looking to kind of build an army like this, some other kind of obvious examples would be most bricky melee armies kind of come quite close to this. So that's things like OBR, Khorne, Iron Jaws, all of that kind of stuff. They're just kind of looking to do this. Take the center, fight you, Nurgle, all that kind of big, slow, stodgy stuff. And they can kind of veer from incredibly aggressive to a lot more kind of defensive, but it's usually kind of, push your toys up in the middle. An example of kind of almost the opposite would be something like this. This is a ton of guns, basically, with some stuff to stand in front of them, but largely it's about the two blobs of 20 Fusiliers sitting at the back. They will sit and shoot you and so on. An army like this is looking to do something quite different. So armies like this almost never play fair. They usually have some way to generate value. Old Seraphon, I think, were the absolute poster child of this, where they could sit back and deal meaningful damage to the opponent while generating resources that allow them to gain models. Which means that the longer that goes on, not only are you losing models and, kind of maybe unable to attack them back if you're playing like a more melee-focused list, they are also gaining models, and the longer the game goes, the larger the attrition disparity will become, because they'll have like 3,000 points of stuff to your 1,000, and then they can just take the table off of you. A lot of shooting armies kind of fall into this, and oftentimes you'll find them, maybe if any army with a ranged advantage can often side into a role sort of like this, where they'll happily give up some scenario pressure for the ability to keep their guns very safe for a turn or two while you kind of whittle down your opponent because there's nothing that they can do about it, forcing either them to come and get you, which can sometimes be a poor attritional play, or forcing them to kind of just weather and take it, which also obviously is bad on attrition because they're losing models and you're not losing any. Generally, this advantage is realized sometime in the later game, and you give up a lot of tempo in the early game. So to go back to the kind of other army, this will usually, if you play these two armies against each other, the Night Hunt is absolutely going to take the tempo in the early game. They're going to decide where the models go, what you're fighting over, etc. This army is going to sit back and just whittle and take what pot shots it can. But then in the late game, if there's only 25% of this army left and there's 50% of this army left, the roles are reversed. This isn't to say that this is the best kind of late game army, it's just usually something to kind of bear in mind. Then, last but not least, just in terms of examples, this is something that I would call a much more kind of scoring-based army. Now, obviously, it's not 100% that, but one of the things that I tried to build into this army is always having a turn 1 tactic and likely being able to do tactics while your opponent doesn't have any models on the table or you don't have that many models on the table, although that's much harder to do in the current edition. But this is a difficult thing to kind of pigeonhole. It was probably easier to do back in 3rd when we had everything a lot more figured out. I would say that, for example, Old Soulblight were the absolute best at this. Is that army, you could give them a paperclip and a dream and they would score 5 tactics and Grand Strat. Not so much the thing in 4th, but I do think that there are some armies out there. Tzeentch is another really good one. Tzeentch probably a better example, honestly, now that I think about it. For something like this, Tzeentch can score the same battle tactic twice, which makes them very, very good at kind of reliably scoring the full 20 from battle tactics. But an army like this is usually less focused on the attrition warfare and more focused on making sure that they get points and perhaps denying you your points. And the more that I think about it, the more I think Tzeentch is absolutely what I should have chosen for this. But generally, things that you can expect from an army like this are choices that are perhaps worse for attrition, but better for scoring. So an example of that would be these 2 units of Wind Chargers. They could probably be something else, but they're really good for turn 1 tactics. I think everybody's used to things like that in an army, but maybe in lists like this, instead of having just 2 units, I have, I think, 5, I would say, that are very good at just running off and scoring tactics. Usually, if you go look at another army like this, like what in this army is doing flanks on turn 1? Like it's maybe you're doing like the Steel Hems and the Cav, like go and do it, but then they're maybe compromising their position, so maybe you want to go do it with like the Hammerers or something, if they like get a run and move order or something. Can you even do the move order on Dwarfs? I'm not 100% sure. But that's kind of what I'm saying. An army like this is usually going to have a lot less difficulty with the tactics. And that's generally where you'll be looking to get your wins. I don't think that this is necessarily true of this army, or indeed of many armies in 4th edition yet, but I think that might be because A, we don't know the game too much, and B, the game isn't that well balanced and everything feels incredibly lethal. So one of the things that I definitely want to touch on is know what you want your army to do and build and take units with that in mind. Try and build into the synergies and such that fit. Like, for example, if you are building a board control army, maybe you don't need to double down on mega attrition power as much as you should take something that perhaps denies your opponent mobility. Or if you're building an army for scoring, maybe you want the teleport artifact instead of the one that does more damage, or vice versa. Similarly, obviously if you're looking for attrition, you're like, right, okay, what lets me kill things? Generally, like to go back to, I think none of these armies actually fit neatly in the one archetype described. Like, for example, to speak of my own list, just because it's the one that I know the most, this often takes the role of being a defensive, low board control army in the early game before, and then also playing some kind of mix between losing primary but never dropping tactics. As a result, you kind of take over in the late game. And because you have the unit of Sentinels, you can kind of whittle away at stuff along with the Wind Chargers and things. You can whittle away at things without actually losing attrition-wise. So it's somewhere in between these two, for example. So I think realizing that and understanding that and kind of knowing what you want to do kind of helps. Also, you can see that this is an old slide because it says Plague Sensor Bearers. This, well, that's awkward, isn't it? Sorry, Skaven players. But yeah, so I think that it's something to bear in mind is that high-level players, and I kind of talk about this here, they'll kind of do thing. It's like in Magic the Gathering, understanding who the beatdown is. If I play against this army outshoots me, you know, with his Luminethus. So I'm not able to play the kind of sit back and shoot and leverage my Sentinels game because they're going to do that better. So I'm going to have to find a way to play an alternative strategy. And that happens a lot. If you have two Night Hunt armies play against each other and one of them is just better in melee, like if one of them is all Hex Race but the other one has two units of Revenants, the Revenants are going to go through those Hex Race faster than the Hex Race go through the Revenants, I think. I think that's how that maths will work out. But one of them is going to have an advantage in the grind. And the one that doesn't have the advantage has to look to start to play differently. And that's another thing that's really important to think of, and it's usually quite a good idea in an open format rather than teams to build alternate ways to play into your army. Whereas in teams you can lean a lot more into the single strategy because you can control your matchups a lot more. I think that's roughly everything that I wanted to cover when it comes to talking about armies. Generally, I think it's just a good foundation to have in mind for future episodes where we're going to talk about how to build lists in more depth. Hopefully that's been helpful. I'll see you next time.